Hello and welcome back everybody to Gotta Be Geek. If you're new here to this channel, hey, how you doing? My name is Mike, and here at Gotta Be Geek, we go through tutorials, talk about dev tools, and just a bunch of other geeky stuff, all to help you be a better engineer or developer. In today's video, that's right, I'm comparing AWS versus Azure, the two top cloud platforms in the industry, contending them against each other. We're gonna look at price, we're gonna look at a couple products, compare some features. Let's get into it. I know. You're probably over there like, but Michael, you work at Microsoft. Of course you're going to pick Azure over AWS. All right, I'll give some credit there. There may be a small level of bias that I'll have because I'm pretty familiar with Azure because I work with it a lot in my day-to-day work. But that being said, I'm going to try and be as objective and unbiased throughout this process, so bear with me regardless of what you think the outcome is going to be, because even if you end up being right and whatever you may think, I'm still probably going to provide some helpful information here that I think would be valuable for you, so stick with me while I go through these comparisons. So here's how I'm going to do the breakdown comparison between the two different cloud platforms. I'm going to do build, setup, and feature comparisons between three different products that AWS and Azure share in common, and then I'm going to do price comparisons between the three different products respectively. The three products I'm going to cover in this video are going to be virtual machines, functions, and container registries. These are also referred to as EC2 for virtual machines in AWS, and then AWS also calls functions Lambdas, and then AWS refers to their container registries as elastic container registries. So I may refer to the common names of just virtual machines, functions, and registries, but just know that there is some specific naming there that AWS has decided to provide on top of theirs. An additional note that I wanted to cover on pricing is that both platforms provide about a year of developer credits for using their platform and getting familiar with things. So when I go through pricing, I'm going to ignore including any of that in the price comparisons to try and keep them as equal as possible. But there is kind of a free tier or almost included amount of certain things for varying products. So just know that, like for functions, for example, when we get to those, there's a certain number of function calls that you get for free in both platforms. And so just bear in mind that some of that is going to be free, and certain SKUs and different products have a certain amount included at different levels. So it can get rather complicated, but just know that I'm not going to be including that kind of trial 1 year level of stuff that's free, because that's only temporary. So I'm not really going to cover the prices for those things and what those cover, because that's likely to change. But I would encourage you to go check it out, and if you're new to either platform, to go see what you can take advantage of in that first year with either platform. All right, now that we know how we're going to break down these comparisons, let's get into them. Let's get ready to rumble. I've always wanted to do that, but all kidding aside, let's start with the first one, which is going to be Azure Virtual Machines versus AWS's EC2. Now, I would say that build and setup was largely the same, and feature set is still pretty much largely the same. I'm going to go over a few differences here. One being that during build and setup, AWS doesn't allow you to choose a name for your virtual machine. You can only distinguish the different ones by using resource tagging. You can also use resource tagging and everything in Azure, but the added benefit being that for virtual machines, you can just give it a name to distinguish them from one and from the other. So if you had a purpose for tagging that you explicitly wanted to use that for, it's nice that you don't have to muddy that with also using it to distinguish between your virtual machines. The next up is a security perspective, which Azure calls JIT, or just-in-time access. So this does cost more, which I'll cover in the pricing part when I get to it, but what this does is it's something you enable on your subscription. It allows you to configure this for your virtual machines, and this adds just an extra layer of inbound security for your virtual machine. So if you have a virtual machine that's you intend to have just a workload that's maybe regularly running on it, some kind of processing, whatever the case may be, and you don't expect people to have to regularly access it, I think this is where this scenario is really going to shine. And what this allows you to do is basically say, well, unless somebody goes in the portal and explicitly triggers this, you go in and you click connect, and then there's a little box that pops up that allows you to write in the IP address or IP address range that you want to whitelist. And then you can click connect, and then it will give you access for like 3 hours by default. You can configure it for a different amount of time. But I think this is nice because then you know only people that already have access to your subscription and then access to see the resource in your portal can now go in and do this. And so it means that you have very intentional and explicit access happening to the virtual machine versus just having your ports and inbound traffic open in general. So I think that's a nice benefit. Now, going into the pricing, because there wasn't much different from that aspect. The first step being, as I said, the security aspect. To enable this upgraded security center plan is going to cost you on your subscription in general. I would encourage you to kind of take a look in this. I'm not going to necessarily try and break down all the scenarios here because it means enabling this security for a lot of things in your subscription, not just virtual machines. But generally, there's going to be a per month cost associated with different resources that would end up taking advantage of this. So check that out in the pricing calculator yourself. I'm just going to stick with the comparison on the virtual machines themselves here. But I would say that pricing is pretty much the same. They're all the scenarios, which I'm going to throw a few up on here, both Linux and Windows with a really low processing and memory power, processing power and memory usage. These two scenarios I think are not necessarily going to be representative of everybody's, but this I think was an easy way to highlight some of the differences. But you'll see here that with these different prices that they're all within a few dollars or so of each other. Most of it depends on the region that you choose, and then whether it's Linux or Windows. Obviously, there are some scenarios depending on the region you choose in AWS where you could pick a Windows machine that's more expensive than Windows in a different region in Azure. So I think it's all relative when they're within a couple of dollars of each other. So I think they're pretty negligible when it comes to price difference in this scenario. But I would encourage you to check out the pricing calculator for your own specific scenario, because obviously certain things can be more complex. Obviously, if you have more demanding needs than what I have in these examples, or if you wanted to use Windows with SQL Server, all these kind of things are likely going to make them more expensive. So I would encourage you to just check some of this out on your own. But I think from a pricing comparison on just the virtual machines, they're pretty much the same. So given some of the kind of more intuitive setup process, I think, when it comes to virtual machines, and then the added security capability that you have with Azure, I would say virtual machines, both on a pricing, because they're pretty much the same, and a feature set, are going to take the win for me. I just think that everything provided, if everything's all the same as far as price, having the ability, even though the upgraded security center plan would cost you more money in the end, I think being able to do that, if that's what's important to you, is more important. So I think having that capability just makes it worth the cost when all things considered. Without the security plan, they're pretty much equal. Now we have functions. There's a lot to cover in comparisons here because they actually have quite a bit different about them. So I'm going to try and get through this as quick as I can, but the main difference, I would say, is how these functions are presented to you, or Lambdas in AWS's case. So Azure has more of what I refer to as a function shell, and then they have inner functions, which kind of creates this function inception. Because if you create a function in Azure, then you can go to your navigation pane on the left and you'll see functions and then an option for functions, and you click on that and then you get your list of actual functions. In AWS, you just go to create a Lambda and then you get presented with templates if you want, or you can start with a blank one and then you create your Lambda. Now, if you're creating a HP triggered serverless API like what I was doing for this example, it gets much more confusing because now you're kind of pushed towards this API gateway that AWS uses to kind of create this REST API abstraction on top of it. And we'll get to it later, but you have to pay for that aspect. So the nice part with Azure is that even though there's that kind of function inception going on, you don't have to pay for that wrapping shell that kind of houses all the inner functions that may serve as your individual API endpoints, but you do have to pay for that in AWS. And I think that the way they present that is just much more confusing. Another difference, all not necessarily a bad thing, is that you get presented with templates right from the get-go for AWS. I'd almost probably say that's a good thing. I think that it's kind of neat right up front, getting presented with things that you can do. Azure, you have to create the base function shell first, and then when you go to create those inner functions, that's when you get access to look at their templates. But both do offer templates to get a developer started right off the bat, which makes that really nice. The next thing I would say that's neat about both of them is that both allow you to write and test your code in the cloud, which is really neat. There are a few gotchas with this whole concept though. One being that AWS doesn't allow you to pick your operating system for your function. I would assume under the hood that they're choosing Linux to run these. Obviously, I have no way to prove that at the moment. I didn't look too extensively either, but that's my assumption. And you can use languages like Node.js and Python. Now, I wouldn't depend on developing in the cloud as a long-term thing. It's just a way to get you started, because the minute you want to start adding packages and other things like that, you definitely would want to do that on your local machine, because as far as I could tell, there was no intuitive way to kind of add packages and things like that without having to like manually maybe upload some files and folders to make it all work. It just seemed rather confusing. I would just say take advantage of either platform's ability to build and create them locally and then publish everything you need from there if you're doing anything advanced. Now, that being said, moving into the writing and testing for Azure's functions, I think they provide a little bit more option here, but they're also a little bit persnickety. So while they do allow you to choose Linux or Windows, you can only write and test your code in the cloud if you choose Windows. I think in the world of serverless APIs or the world of serverless in general, I think that the operating system you're running on is probably a little bit less important. That's just my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's as important. So I think choosing Windows here is definitely not a bad choice. There's also the added advantage that you're going to have .NET Core on here as well, and you'll be able to write your function in C# versus Node.js. And if you haven't watched it, I did have a video that I had done before this one for configuration with Azure functions, and I showed some examples contrasting Node.js functions versus C# functions. And I think in that video it was rather clear that you get a lot more benefit from the C# functions for a variety of reasons. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free. I'll put the link for that video in the description below and somewhere up here on the top. I'm pointing both directions because I've yet to remember which part of me that little thing slides in on. So click on it when it shows up if you want to watch that video. And then the last part is going to be the pricing. So pricing for these is also an area where it kind of gets quite a bit different as well. So we're going to start off with the simple one, which is Azure. And so Azure, if we do a 1.5 million, which is the number I went with, because they have a free amount, not part of that 1 year kind of trial thing I'd mentioned earlier, but for just in general for functions, you get so many calls per month for free. So I went above that to try and get a realistic number and an actual price besides free. And so I went with 1.5 million. So 1.5 million function calls per month for Azure lands you at a whopping 20 cents per month. And so I think this is really neat, because this means that if you could have a fairly substantial or decently used serverless API and getting calls to it every month, and it's only going to cost you maybe a buck, like we're at 20 cents for 1.5 million. So just imagine, you could probably have a pretty popular website running on that, and it's not going to cost you very much money. Moving into AWS, that's where things get a little bit confusing. If you want to use just the Lambda and have to use their SDK to call your function rather than their API gateway, which just makes things much more confusing, you land at a whopping 10 cents per month. So yes, you are indeed cheaper than Azure in that aspect, but you're losing all the goodness from the API gateway that we talked about earlier. So confusing or not, this API gateway definitely makes calling your function or accessing it from a REST API perspective much simpler. But you are paying for it, as I said earlier. You're going to pay a whopping $5.25 per month with your function or your Lambda and the API gateway combined versus the 20 cents that you got from Azure. So both on a feature set, capability to use different operating systems, how the whole function concept is presented to you, and on a pricing aspect, I think Azure takes a huge win away when it comes to functions. All right, moving on to container registries. I'm pretty excited for this one because I had to learn some stuff to get through this one. And so if just like me, you're interested in learning about Docker and container registries and you want to watch a video to kind of catch up on some of that stuff, I'll have a link for the video I watched to learn some of the stuff about Docker in the description below, so go check that out. Now, the build and setup for container registries was largely almost identical between both platforms because the interaction with the container registries is largely dependent on your use of Docker to build and publish images. So the only other real comparison here is going to be features and price. Now, feature-wise, AWS just has one flat offering, making it very simple, and you pay a flat rate, which we'll get into pricing here in a little bit, and you get retention policy management and things like that. Azure has 3 different tiers: their basic, standard, and premium tiers. Those tiers have different amounts of storage that all cost a different amount per day. And then at the premium tier is when you actually finally get to take advantage of the retention policy management that Azure offers. Now, the real big win here that I think AWS takes is that their retention policy management offered it just their full package. It comes with retention policy management that's flexible for a variety of scenarios, whether they're untagged resources or images or tagged images. But Azure only provides you the mechanism to manage retention policies for untagged images or resources. So I think that AWS really gets a leg up here on features because they just give you retention policies from the get-go, whereas you have to pay quite a bit significantly in getting into that premium tier for Azure before you get those retention policies. So from a feature set, AWS really does take a big win here. Now, you could say, though, that it's not that huge of a deal because you may not need to manage retention policies because if you're at a really low amount of storage, say like 20 gigabytes, which we'll use as an example here in the pricing in a bit, you may not need those retention policies. And now, I'm not necessarily sure because I didn't spend a huge amount of time creating tons of different images if 20 gigabytes would ever even be realistic for someone to need in a container registry. You may end up needing tons of storage all the time. But I digress. If you were doing something smaller, you may not need the retention policies if you're maybe just managing a couple images and you're not doing a lot of tagging because you're not managing a very expansive different set of images that are all different versions and whatnot. So that being said, you may not really need those retention policies at the lower tier, but it's nice to know that regardless of that fact, you get them with AWS. Moving into the pricing comparison, so going into that 20 gigabyte example I gave before, if we were doing 20 gigabytes of storage at 5 gigabytes of data transfer out with AWS, we'd be paying $2 a month. Then moving into Azure, assuming we want the basic tier, there's two different ways we could look at this pricing. I'll go over the actual correct way and then explain a kind of confusing way and how I got to that here in a moment. But the correct way is that in the pricing calculator in Azure, compared to their pricing sheet, which shows things in gigabytes, their pricing calculator lists them as units. So if you paid for 1 unit of basic storage at 10 gigabytes being the 10 gigabytes for the basic tier, and then paid the extra daily rate that they include on top of that, you'd be paying $5 per month for that. Now, in retrospect, that's not a really big price difference, but it's enough to make you wonder why you would want to pay more for the same amount of storage with more capability when it comes to AWS. But we'll move into another example here, and that's going to be at 500 gigabytes of storage, which would give us the kind of bar or the cap for the standard tier where we get those retention policies. So at 500 gigabytes of storage, again, just to keep it simple with 5 gigabytes of data transfer out, and again, those numbers may not necessarily be realistic, but this is just to give you an example of what the pricing may look like. Both of them land at a flat $50 per month. Now, back to that example I gave about units before and why I think this is kind of confusing because AWS and Azure both have a common practice, I think, that I've seen, and that's that both of them show a pricing sheet that kind of breaks down their pricing, and they both include a pricing calculator for you to break down and actually put values in and play around with it to see how much something's going to cost based on your exact needs rather than you having to go do those calculations elsewhere. Now, AWS was consistent in that their pricing details showed a per gigabyte charge, and then in the calculator they asked how many gigabytes you wanted to store. But in Azure, they kind of really made this confusing because the pricing detail says you get 10 gigabytes of storage with a basic tier, but then they have an additional cost on top of that, meaning that it's okay if you go over that, but you'll pay this extra cost, and that cost is the same regardless. So at the standard tier, which includes up to 100 gigabytes, anything over that 100 gigabytes, you're still going to pay the same flat amount over that per day. Now, the reason this is confusing is because in the pricing calculator for Azure, they list it as units. So you select the basic tier, and then you enter how many units you want to pay for 30 days. This unit corresponds to the top end value for each tier. So basic being 10 gigabytes as their top end, 1 unit equates to 10 gigabytes. If you were to pay for 2 units of the basic tier giving you 20 gigabytes, which is again how I was saying earlier, there is an incorrect way to look at it, this would land you at $10 per month, whereas the previous example landed you at $5.90 per month, which is actually the correct value. So it's really confusing on why they decided to list this as units and why you would want to pay for units in this way rather than just entering how many gigabytes you want to use and letting them do the math. I think this makes the whole experience rather confusing. So confusing, believe it or not, I wanted to be absolutely sure what these units represented because I couldn't find anything that explicitly said if one unit correlated to 1 GB or if one unit correlated to one of those tier amounts. So I wanted to experience what I thought someone else might experience, and I took the time to reach out to a sales representative in the little chat box on the pricing calculator page and get some clarity. Now, really disappointing to my experience was that the person I spoke with in the chat box couldn't tell me what this equated to. They had made the decision they didn't have enough information to answer my question and decided that they needed to forward me on to a specialist to answer my question. I gotta say, this was a pretty big downer for me, saying that you couldn't answer a simple question on the pricing page when you're supposed to be a sales agent. I know that this was probably a sales tactic to try and get me into doing more with my own personal subscription. And they asked me tons of questions about my business and all that kind of thing. I just think that it was way overkill. At the end of the day, I ended up having 2 support tickets initiated just to have the specialist come talk to me. This wasn't something I did. The person I spoke with ended up, I guess, accidentally making 2 support tickets, and then I got 2 different emails from 2 different support people, one from a support engineer and one from a specialist. And it took like 4 or 5 back and forth emails to correctly explain what my question was in a way that they got it, and then they finally answered it. So I just think that that whole experience was really disappointing to get what should have been just simple from the get-go and just listing gigabytes on the calculator page. So definitely, if you're watching this, anybody that does the Azure sales page, take note of that experience, because truth be told, it sucked. For my final evaluation for container registries, both feature and price-wise, I would say that based on not only my experience with the sales side of this, but just the feature offering and the bang for your buck, what you're getting for AWS versus Azure, both on features and price, AWS takes a rather large win in this category for me. So sorry to say, Azure, but AWS really beat you out on this one. All right. So my hat goes off to both platforms and both companies for providing an immense experience and a lot of offerings in their cloud platforms. I obviously couldn't compare every single thing in this comparison. I just wanted to compare a few things. So there are definitely some things in either respective platform that's offered that the other one doesn't, that may set them apart for your unique scenario. I just wanted to compare a few things that I think are pretty common for a lot of people's use cases that both platforms offer, and shed some light on some experience and opinion between the both. So you're coming into this and you're wondering, wow, what's this guy gonna say? And I know at the beginning of the video, based on what I said, you're probably thinking, I'm gonna say Azure, and I'm gonna tell you it really depends. There's no good answer. I'm gonna say both. If it were something like container registries, I would say go with AWS. If it were something like virtual machines, I would say go with Azure, or functions to go with Azure. There's probably a number of things that you could probably just use one or the other with. Now, one of the things I would say to look at, though, is just look at your unique situation, because you want to use the pricing calculator on the individual company's websites and determine based on your scenario which one's going to work right for you. But I would say similar, if you haven't watched my video before on the Visual Studio versus VS Code aspect, the same reason I have both of those on my machine, both have their own unique scenarios that they're useful for. And so I have both of them because they serve individual purposes. So in this case, I think it's one of those things where I think it's okay to say that you could just use AWS and Azure side by side. There are some scenarios where obviously they might not work because you have certain things that need to work together. And so you have to use Azure for both X, Y, Z, and you can't split that across AWS or Azure because it'd be more expensive. But I would just definitely encourage you to take a look. I think both are really good. And that's where it lands. So I know that's probably not the answer that you wanted, but I would say that that's just really my opinion, is that you should just use both. Use both. Of course it's Azure. What was wrong with you, AWS? Azure definitely won this one. Like I was ever going to recommend AWS to you guys. Azure definitely takes the win on this one. You should pick Azure regardless of anything I've said in this video. Pick Azure. I'm just kidding, guys. Again, I'm definitely serious. Both of them provide their own use cases. Check out the pricing calculators. Big disclaimer here. Anything I've shown pricing wise here is just estimations. You even say it in their estimation and calculator that their estimations, what you pay at the end of the month may be different. So don't look at what I've quoted here as like the end all be all. I know that somebody's gonna wanna just go on the keyboard and be like, that's not right, that costs me more money. Don't do it. Don't go down there and comment that, because I'm not responsible for that. You need to invest the time. Go see which one is right for you in the pricing calculator that meets your needs. If there's something you have questions on feature set wise and you want to know more about it and you have some questions, feel free to ask me. Definitely try and give it a shot to talk to the salespeople and ask them if you want. I'll be down in the comments section. Tell me what cloud provider you think is really neat, or which one you're using, why you chose them, and why you didn't choose one or the other. I think it'd be really interesting to hear some different people's opinions in the comments section down below. As always, that's it for me. This has been super fun, but it's not it for you. If you haven't liked this video, definitely go down there, smash that like button, because it really helps me out. And if you haven't subscribed, consider subscribing, hit that bell, and then I will see you guys in the next one.